Chapter 29. They was fetching up a nice-looking old gentleman along, and a nice-looking younger one, with his right arm in a sling, and my souls, how the people yelled and laughed and kept it up. But I didn't see no joke about it, and I judged it would strain the Duke and the King some to see any. I reckoned they'd turn pale. But no, nary a pale did they turn. The Duke he never let on he suspicioned what was up, but just went around goo-gooing, happy and satisfied, like a jug that's goo-googling out buttermilk. And as for the king, he just gazed and gazed down, sorrowful on them newcomers, like it give him a stomach ache in his very heart to think that there could be such frauds and rascals in the world. Oh, he done it admirable. Lots of the principal people gathered around on the king to let him see they was on his side. That old gentleman that had just come looked all puzzled to death. Pretty soon he begun to speak, and I see straight off he pronounced like an Englishman. Not the king's way, though the king's was pretty good for an imitation. I can't give the old gent's words, nor I can't imitate him. But he turned to the crowd and says, about like this, "This is a surprise to me, which I wasn't looking for, and I'll acknowledge, candid and frank, I ain't very well fixed to meet it and answer it. For my brother and me has had misfortunes. He's broke his arm, and our baggage got put off at a town above here last night in the night by mistake. I am Peter Wilkes's brother Harvey, and this is his brother William, which can't hear nor speak, and can't even make signs to amount to much, now that he's only got the one hand to work with. We are who we say we are, and in a day or two, when I get the baggage, I can prove it. But up till then, I won't say nothing more, but go to the hotel and wait." So him and the new dummy started off, and the king he laughs and blathers out, "Broke his arm. Very like it, ain't it? And very convenient, too, for a fraud that's got to make signs and ain't learned how? Lost their baggage. Well, that's mighty good, and mighty ingenious, under the circumstances." So he laughed again, and so did everybody else, except for 3 or 4, maybe half a dozen. One of these was that doctor. Another one was a sharp-looking gentleman with a carpet-bag full of the old-fashioned kind made out of carpet stuff, that had just come off the steamboat and was talking to him in a low voice and glancing toward the king now and then and nodding their heads. Why, it was Levi Bell, the lawyer that had gone up to Louisville. And another one was the big tough husky that had come along and listened to all the old gentleman said and was listening to the king now. And when the king got done, this husky up and says, "Well, looky here. You are Harvey Wilkes. When'd you come to this town?" "Well, the day before the funeral, friend," says the king. But what time of day?" "In the evening, about an hour or two before sundown." "Well, how'd you come?" "Well, I come down on the Susan Powell from Cincinnati." "Well then, how'd you come to be up at the pint in the morning in a canoe?" "Well, I warn't up at the pint in the morning." "It's a lie," says the husky fellow. Well, several of them jumped for him and begged for him not to talk that way to an old man, a preacher. "Preacher be hanged. He's a fraud and a liar. He was up at the pint that morning. I live up there, don't I? Well, I was up there, and he was up there, and I seen him there. He come in a canoe, along with Tim Collins and a boy." The doctor he up and says, "Would you know the boy again, if you were to see him, Hines?" "Well, I reckon I would. But I don't know. Why, yonder he is now. I know him perfectly easy." And it was me he pointed at. And the doctor says, "Neighbors, I don't know whether the new couple is a fraud or not, But if these two ain't frauds, I'm an idiot. And that's all. I think it's our duty to see that they don't get away from here till we've looked into this thing. Now come along, Hines. Come along, the rest of you. We'll take these fellows to the tavern and affront them with the other couple. I reckon we'll find out something before we get through. Well, it was all nuts for the crowd, though maybe not for the king's friends. So we all started. And it was about sundown. The doctor, he led me along by the hand and was pretty kind enough, but he never let go of my hand. We all got into a big room at the hotel, lit up some candles, and fetched the new couple. And first the doctor, he says, I don't wish to be too hard on these two men, but I think they're frauds. And they may have accomplices that we don't know nothing about. If they have accomplices, get away with that bag of gold Peter Wilkes left? It ain't unlikely. If these men ain't frauds, they won't object to sending for that money and letting us keep it till they prove that they're all right. Now ain't that so? Well, everybody agreed to that. So I judged they had our gang in a pretty tight space at the right outstarts. But the king, he only looks sorrowful and says, Gentlemen, I wish that money was there, for I ain't got no disposition to throw anything in the way of the fair, open and out investigation of this miserable business. But alas, the money, it ain't there. You can send and see if you want to. Where is it then? Well, when my niece gave it to me and I kept it for her and took it and hid inside a straw tick in my bed, not wishing to bank it for a few days, so that we'd be here, and considering the bed a safe place. We not being used to the slaves and supposing them honest, like servants here in England. Well, the slaves, they stole it the very next morning, after I went downstairs. And when I sold them, I ain't missed the money yet. So they clean got away with it. My servant here can tell you about that, gentlemen. Well, the doctor and several said, Shucks. And I see nobody didn't altogether believe him. One man asked me if I seen the slave steal it. I said no. I seen him sneaking out of the room and hustling away. And I only never thought nothing. I only reckoned they was afraid they'd waked up my master. Was trying to get away before he made trouble with them. And that was all they asked me. But then the doctor whirls on me and says, Are you English too? And I says yes. And him and some of the others laughed and said, Stuff that! Well, then they sailed in on the general investigation. And there we had it, up and down, hour in, hour out. Nobody never said a word about supper, nor ever seemed to think about it. So they kept it up and kept it up. And it was the worst mixed up everything you ever did see. They made the king tell his yarn, and they made the old gentleman tell his'n. Anybody but a lot of prejudiced chucklehead would have seen that the old gentleman was spinning the truth and the other one was telling lies. By and by, they had me up to tell what I knowed. And the king, he gave me a left-handed look out of the corner of his eye. So I knowed enough to talk on the right side. And this is where I, as your humble narrator, say, What the hell, man? Why you gotta diss on the left-handed folk? That don't seem right. And back into the story we go. And I knowed enough to talk on the right side. I begun to tell about Sheffield, and how we lived there, all about the English Wilkses, and so on. I didn't get pretty fur until the doctor began to laugh, and Levi Bell, the lawyer, says, Sit down, boy. I wouldn't strain myself if I was you. I reckon you ain't used to lying. It don't seem to come handy. What you want is practice, 'cause you do it pretty awkward. I didn't care nothing for that compliment, but I was be glad to be let off anyway. Well, the doctor, he started to say something and turns and says, If you'd have been in town at first, Levi Bell, Well, the king, he broke in and reached out his hand and he says, "Why, this is my old poor dead brother's old friend that he's rode off and so about." The lawyer and him shook hands, and the lawyer smiled and looked pleased. And they talked right along all the while. And they got off to one side and talked low. And at last the lawyer, he speaks up and says, "That'll fix it. I'll take the order and send it along with your brothers. And then they'll know it's all right." So they got them some paper and a pen, and the king, he sat down, twisted his head to one side, and chawed his tongue and scrawled off something. And then they give the pen to the duke. And then for the first time the duke looked sick. But he took the pen and he wrote. And then the old lawyer, he turns to the new old gentleman and says, "If you and your brother please to sign a line or two and write a line or two and sign your names." Well, the old gentleman, he wrote, but nobody couldn't read it. And the lawyer, he looked powerful astonished and says, "Well, it beats me," and snaked a lot of old letters out of his pocket and examined them. And then "Well, it beats me." And then he snaked a lot of old letters out of his pocket and examined them. And then he examined the old man's writing. And then them again. And then he says, "These old letters is from Harvey Wilkes. And here's these two handwritings. And anybody can see they didn't write them." And the king and the duke look old and sold and foolish. And I tell you, to see how the lawyer took them in. And here's this old gentleman's handwriting. Anybody can tell easy enough he didn't write them. Fact is, Scratcher, he makes improper for writing at all. Now here's some letters from, and the new old gentleman says, "If you please, let me explain. Nobody can read my hand but my brother here. So he copies for me. It's his hand you've got there, not mine." "Well," says the lawyer, "this is a state of things. I've got some of William's letters too. So if you'll get him to write a line or two, then we can—" "Well, he can't write with his left hand," says the old gentleman. "If you use his right hand, you would see that he wrote some of his own letters, and mine too. Look at both, please. They're by the same hand." Well, the lawyer, he done it, and then he says, "I believe it's so. And if it ain't so, it's a heap stronger resemblance than I'd noticed before. Anyway, well, I thought we was on the right track of the solution. But now that's gone to grass partly. And anyway, one thing is proved. These two ain't neither of them Wilkes's." And he wagged his head toward the king and the duke. Well, what do you think? That the old mule-headed old fool wouldn't give them then? Indeed he wouldn't. Said it weren't no fair test. Said his brother William was the cussedest joker in the world. And he hadn't tried to write. He see William was going to play one of his jokes the minute he put the pen to paper. So he warmed up and went on a warbling right along till he was actually beginning to believe what he was saying him own self. But pretty soon the new gentleman broke in and says, "I've thought of something. Is there anybody here that helped to lay out the late Peter Wilkes for burying?" "Well, yes," says somebody. "Me and Ab Terminer done it. We're both here." Then the old man turns toward the king and says, "Perhaps this gentleman can tell me what was tattooed on my brother's breast." Blamed the king didn't have to brace up mighty quick, or he'd been squished down like a bluff bank on the river that was cut out from under. So it took him so sudden, and mind you, it was a thing that was calculated to make most anybody squish to get fetched with a solid one such as that without any notice. Because how was he going to know what was tattooed on the man? Well, he whitened a little. He couldn't help it. But it was still pretty mighty still in there. And everybody was bending toward the little, gazing at him. And I says to myself, now he'll throw up the sponge. There ain't no use. Well, did he? A body can't help believe it, but he didn't. I reckon he thought he'd keep the thing up till he was tired them out, and they'd be so thin and him and the Duke could break loose and get away. Anyway, he sat there. Pretty soon he began to smile and says, That's a tough question, isn't it? Yes, sir. I can tell you what's tattooed on his breast. It's just a small, thin, blue arrow. That's just what it is. If you don't look close, you can't see it. Now, what do you say there, hey? I never seen anything like that old blister for clean out and out cheek. Well, the new gentleman, he turns brisk towards Abe Turner and his pard, and his eyes lights up, and he judged he'd got the king this time, and he says, There, you've heard what he said. Was there any such mark on Peter Wilkes' breast? Both of them up and says, We didn't see no mark. Well, good, says the old gentleman. Now, what did you see on his breast? Was a small dim P and a small B, which is an initial he dropped when he was very young. And then a W and dashes in between them. So P, B, W. And he marked them down on the way to that piece of paper. Now, come, isn't that what you saw? And both of them spoke up again and says, No, we didn't. We never seen any marks at all. Well, everybody was in a state of mind now, and they sings out, The whole bottom line of them's frauds. Let's dug them. Let's drown them. Let's ride them out on a rail. Everybody was whooping and whopping at once, and it was a rattling powwow. But the lawyer, he jumps on the table and he yells and says, Gentlemen, hear me just a word, just a single word, if you please. There's one way yet. Let's go and dig up the corpse and look. Well, that took 'em. Hooray! They all shouted. They was starting right off, but the lawyer and the doctor sung out, Hold on. Call her all four of these men, the young boy, and fetch them along too. We'll do it, they all shouted. And if we don't find them marks, we'll lunch the whole gang. I was scared now, I tell you. But there weren't no getting away, you know. They gripped us all, and they marched us right along, straight to the graveyard, which was 1.5 miles down the river. And the whole town at our heels, for we made noise enough. It was only 9 in the evening. Well, as we went by our house, I wished I hadn't sent Mary Jane out of town, because now, if I could tip her the wink, she'd light out and save me, and blow on our deadbeats. Well, we swarmed along down the river road, just carrying on like wildcats. To make it more scary, the sky was darkening up, the lightning began to wink and flitter, and the wind to shiver amongst the leaves. It was the most awful trouble and most dangersome I ever was in. I was kind of stunned. Everything was going so different from what I had allowed for. Instead of being fixed so I could make my own time, if I'd wanted to, and see all the fun, and have Mary Jane at my back to save me and set me free when it come close fit time. Here was nothing in the world betwixt me and sudden death but them tattoo marks. If they didn't find him, well, I couldn't bear to think about it. And yet, somehow, I couldn't think about nothing else. It got darker and darker. It was a beautiful time to give the crowd a slip. But that big husky, he had me by the wrist, Hines, and a body might as well try to give Gaulier the slip. He dragged me right along. He was so excited I had to run to keep up. When they got there, they swarmed into the graveyard and washed over it like an overflow. When they got to the grave, they found about 100 times as many shovels as they wanted. But ain't nobody thought to fetch a lantern. But they sailed into digging it away by the flicker of the lightning, and sent a man to the nearest house, 1/2 mile off, to borrow one. So they dug, and like everything. And it got awful dark, and it started to rain, The wind swished and swooshed along. The lightning come brisker and brisker. And the thunder boomed. But them people never took no notice of it. They was so full of this business. And one minute you could see everything, every face in that big crowd. The shovelfuls of dirt sailing up out of the grave. The next second the dark wiped it all out. You couldn't see nothing at all. At last they got out the coffin and begun to unscrew the lid. And then such another crowd and shouldering and shoving as there was, to scrooge in and get a sight, you never see. And in the dark that way, it was awful. Hines, he hurt my wrist, dreading pulling and tugging me so, and I reckon he clean forgot I was in the world. He was so excited and panting. And all of a sudden, the lightning let go a perfect sluice of white glare, and somebody sings out, "By the jingo! There's the bag of gold on his breast!" Hines, he let out a whoop like everybody else, and dropped my wrist, and gave a big surge to bust in his way and get a look. And the way I lit out and skinned for the road, in the dark, there ain't nobody that can tell. Why, I had the road all to myself, and I fairly flew. At least I had it all to myself except the solid dark, and now and then the glares, and the buzzing of the rain, and the thrashing of the wind, and the spitting of the thunder, and sure as you were born, I did clip it along. When I struck the town, I see there weren't nobody out in the storm, so I never hunted for it in no back streets, but humped it straight through the main one. When I began to get near towards our house, I aimed my eye and set it. No light there. The house was all dark, which made me feel sorry and disappointed. And I didn't know why. But at last I was just sailing by. Flash comes the light in the window, Mary Jane's window. My heart settled up so sudden like to bust. In the same second, the house and all was behind me in the dark. It wasn't ever going to be before me no more in this world. She was the best girl I ever see, and had the most sand. The minute I was far enough above town to see I could make out the towhead, I began to look sharp for a boat to borrow. And the first time the lightning showed me one that wasn't I snatched it and shoved. It was a canoe, and it weren't fastened to nothing but a rope. The towhead was a rattling big distance off, away out there in the middle of the river, but I didn't lose no time. And when I struck the raft at last, I was so fagged I could have just laid down to blow and gasped if I could have afforded it. But I didn't. As I sprung aboard, I sung out, "Out with you, Jim! And set her loose! Glory be to goodness, we're shut of them!" And Jim, he lit out and was a-coming for me, both arms spread. He was so full of joy. But when I glimpsed him in the lightning, my heart shot up my mouth. I looked and I went backwards. For I forgot he was old King Lear and had drowned an Arab all in one. It almost scared the livers and lights right out of me. But Jimmy fished me out and was going to hug me and bless me and so on. So glad I was back and we was shut the King and the Duke, but I says, "Not now. Have it for breakfast. Have it for breakfast. Cut loose and let her slide." So in 2 seconds, away we went, sliding down the river. And it did seem so good to be free again and all by ourselves on the big river, and nobody to bother us. I had to skip around a bit, to jump up and crack my heels a few times. I couldn't help it. But around the third crack, I noticed sound I knowed mighty well, and I held my breath and listened, and waited. Sure enough, when the next flash busted out over the water, here they come, and just a-laying to their oars and making their skiff hum. It was the King and Duke. So I wilted right down onto the planks then and give up. It was all I could do to keep from crying.